Welcome to the New Books Network.
Welcome to New Books and Literary Studies. I am John Yargo, your host. At a moment when the world has tipped over into irreversible violence and corruption, a divinity contacts a righteous man. The man is directed to build a giant ship and bring aboard animals who will spend an indefinite amount of time living, sleeping, and eating alongside Noah and his family. The rain begins to fall, and these survivors take refuge on the ark. After 40 days, the survivors disembark and then have to figure out how to create a new settlement as the waters recede. This cryptic, elliptical ancient story has inspired theological commentary, architecture, and children's toys, giving us an abundance of metaphors and narratives to understand our past, present, and future climate crises. Our continuing attempts to critically examine the Ark narrative and its long afterlife in our imagination is the subject of Jeffrey J. Cohen and Julian Yates' new book, Noah's Arkive, just published by the University of Minnesota Press in 2023. Jeffrey Cohen is Dean of Humanities at the College of Liberal Arts and Sciences at Arizona State University. Jeffrey's previous books include Stone, An Ecology of the Inhuman, Hybridity, Identity, and Monstrosity in Medieval Britain, and Of Giants, Sex, Monsters, and the Middle Ages. Julian Yates is H. Fletcher Brown Professor of English and Material Culture at the University of Delaware. Julian's previous books include Of Sheep, Oranges, and Yeast, A Multispecies Impression, and Error, Misuse, Failure, Object Lessons from the English Renaissance. Welcome to the podcast, Julian and Jeffrey.
Thank you. Happy to be here.
What is the central argument of Noah's Arkive?
Julian, what is the central argument? Because I'm never sure on that.
I know. Whenever I see a question like that, oh gosh, the book is over. Now that's someone else's problem. So John, rather than give in to my worst proclivities and to throw the question back at you, John, because we basically, Jeffrey and I would both much prefer to hear you talk than for us to respond to your questions, is the truth. But the central argument is that if we tend to sort of think of arcs as achieved objects, and if you sort of take the sort of the sort of standard sort of visuals that we have from the Genesis story of landfall, rainbow, happy animals streaming off an ark into a new world moving forward, that if you actually take the time to reread the Genesis story, or just read the Genesis story, then it throws you into a question of making, of building, of process, and it asks you to grapple with all the very difficult questions about inclusion, occlusion, who's left off the ark, and the sets of relationships, or the necessary relationships, between including some aboard an ark and excluding others. What does it mean to try and actually reduce the world to a finite structure where you're claiming that you have everything you need on board to start over? And so in a very kind of challenging way, what we call arc thinking is returning the story to that puzzling sense of process, and the exposure of anyone who actually sort of reads the story to all the questions from the mundane, putting your hand up and sort of, so when we design this, how much space do we have? All of these sort of minute design questions you re-encounter and understand also in a scaled up version of sort of profound ethical, political questions. Jeffrey, how did I do?
Add a little footnote to that, because that was better articulated than I could ever even approach. One of the reasons why we wrote the book is that with all of this in mind, that thinking about the ark is thinking about preservation, futurity, ethics, you name it, is that we live in a time of climate change and climate catastrophe. And whether we are conscious of it or not, we tend to deploy the ark and the Noah story as a trope that helps us to understand what survival during this time of catastrophe might be. One of the things that we hope we achieved in the book was to show that there are alternative ways of narrating the Noah story, and that some of them will give us a wider sense of refuge, than the traditional narrowed version of the Ark in its, kind of idea of a singular vessel preservation might present.
Reading your book, I was struck at the archive that you have put together. You were both trained as literary scholars, and your earlier work focuses on early English and Renaissance texts. But this book weaves together just such a broad range of sources, from conversations you've had with modern art builders, pop culture. There's a great section on toy history. Why did this project call for a break from traditional disciplinary boundaries?
Maybe a way for my way in is to reframe that question as, what is it about the break in traditional boundaries that called you to this project? Meaning that it's the kind of project that you can't do it's the kind of project that you cannot do if you self-relegate to a single media. Because this is a story of conservation, climate change, catastrophe, because it's a story that crosses the millennia, because it's a story we cannot stop telling, you have to look at all the ways in which narrative keeps instantiating itself. So one of the great thrills of being able to work on this project together is that it enabled us to browse, get to know, invent with a copious archive that spans ages, medias, tropes, genres, you name it. There's something really attractive about that because humans think they're stories in various forms that converge.
Right. And so one of the things that I think in terms of sort of tracking different fault lines through the archive is that the sort of the question to which different media, different realizations of arcs in different materials make visible or audible or thinkable different aspects of the story. I mean, I think it's also fair to say, Jeffrey, that, especially with Stone, that, you and I have all both sort of, do you consider yourself a literary scholar?
Yeah, I'm not even sure what that is. That doesn't seem like a good designation.
In other words, what I'm just trying to say, John, is that there was a sense in which we were. You from Monsters and Giants on, that they're only partially belong in literary text. So there's a certain. I think both of us have always been fairly sort of happy with sort of straying or just beyond our periods, but also a sense that the story of the Ark is a story that is a part of a general text that's sometimes in stories, but also in the world around you. If you just take a look at the Google Maps version of your city, or just wander around, you're going to run into arks. Sometimes they'd even be called arks. Daycare centers mostly. Church shops, right? Resale shops. This sort of the ark becomes this sort of movable trope. So it's in the world, part of our infrastructures, and that's really the kind of infrastructural approach to reading that we sort of cultivate. So for me, at least, the Noah's Ark book is a kind of realization of what was the sort of default method. I think for both of us, for quite some for previous books, and I'm very happy working that way. Partly because it sort of communicates to me the relevance of stories, deep old stories, in continuously making the world around us, sometimes keeping it the same in very challenging, difficult, unpleasant ways, but also always sort of creating opportunities for something else to happen.
The subtitle of Julian's last book was a multi-species impression. And I think really that word impression signifies so much of what Julian and I share as we try to think about the ways in which various things that may be narrative in a word form, or maybe just is an object exerting its eccentric agency, but the ways in which those things tend to impress themselves within the human world and register all kinds of after effects. So I think one of the things that made our collaboration seem natural is that we're both predisposed to think outside of text. It's just the way we approach the work that we do in the world.
And John, there was one other thing in your question that I thought was interesting and we haven't responded to, and that was why these texts, why these things. And to a certain extent, I think we would both be very comfortable with and expect people to because this is sort of what happened when we were writing. It became a sort of joke for us that there was always another arc that we didn't know about, and didn't have time now to write about. So it's not a complete archive. It is an indefinitive work, if that's a word. In terms of that, these were the materials that clearly sort of belonged in the book. They sort of told us that they needed to be there. I'm sure there are more.
I think many of the people that would be listening to this podcast are working on dissertations or maybe thinking about a book project and might be drawn to the kind of interdisciplinary work you're talking to. What advice would you give to a scholar, maybe an early career scholar who's thinking about putting together a project like this? What perils, what possibilities await them?
Ask lots of people and keep asking. But I mean, when push comes to shove, for me, you have to sort of, I mean, for me, it's about sort of what work do you like? What work makes you want to get out of bed in the morning and read and write, and try to be honest with yourself about doing that. And there are always pros and cons to any set of decisions. But the only thing I think I can control about the profession is the work that I'm able, to do and feel makes me sort of feel like I want to keep doing work.
And related to that is also the question of how much risk are you willing to take?
Yeah.
And if you do a project that is eccentric to the ways in which projects are traditionally done, you are taking a risk. I think it's good to own that, but to also be cognizant of the fact that it might not work out. You might not actually find the audience that your project deserves. And that is a possible outcome of any book, any research project. And I think fundamentally it's the earliest risk you take if you're working on a dissertation. Are you writing it to please your dissertation advisors and readers? Are you writing it to call into being an audience that you want to read rather than the audience that you know? And I think in the end, respect yourself for the choices you make. You may wind up making a more cautious choice, and that's also fine.
Yeah.
I like both of those points. Embracing inconclusiveness, or just reconciling yourself to the fact that your archive is going to be expanded on, it's going to be taken up by others, and maybe being honest about the level of risk you're comfortable with. That both of those seem like great pieces of advice to me. There's a line that gets repeated throughout the book. Quote, "Maybe the worst thing you can ever believe is that you are no longer on an ark," end quote. It's a kind of refrain. Can you talk us through that claim and why there is so much peril in this belief?
One of the things that Julie and I came to realize in the process of writing the book is that you can never get outside of what the ark figures. You just disembark it in order to wind up in another space that can enarc itself very easily. And in fact, we were very drawn to figures who either refused to board or refused to leave. Refused to get off. And we have this great scene of Mrs. Noah praying for rain rather than wanting to disembark from the ark and trying to think through what that actually means. Ark without end.
I think the other part of the line, right, is that there's such a pull towards landfall and disembarkation. And we were struck by the way in which that while the ark seems to serve as a transit device, right, from one world to another world, that moment of disembarkation, of landfall, is a danger moment in terms of what comes next, because it's also a moment of forgetting. It's a moment at which what the ark was, theoretically, that's the whole world right there, right? And then what happens at the moment of landfall is that the ark disappears, but becomes the entirety of the world that now exists. And so it's a radical moment of forgetting, and also of the allure of complete destruction of everything that came before. And so on the one hand, aspects of the story that, in other words, this is fiction, that the inside of the structure can become completely synonymous with the outside, that there's no remainders, it's a complete restart, there's nothing left to remember. And so it's a foundation effect, or it's an attempt to try and create a new ground. So the arc is still there, even as you think you're not on it. And so it's this moment at which you sort of have to just put your hand up and protest at the entire. In other words, if you buy into the narrative at that point of getting off, it's like the allure, because it's all the affect and emotion. It's fun to get off. We want to get off. Everyone's getting off. It's like getting off a plane. Everyone's off with the seatbelts. To hell with the seatbelt sign. We're still taxiing. I want off. But with the arc, the problem is that you actually have to believe that the outside no longer exists, that everyone died, when in fact, maybe not. Maybe there are whole other ways of being, that your act of exiting the arc and thinking that you're no longer on it is actually making impossible, making unthinkable, not seeing.
I also appreciate that you called that line a refrain, because I think that is what it became for us, where, the book has a certain iterative structure to it, and yet keeps coming back to certain things that either we knew or we had to remind ourselves of. So who first wrote that line? I have no idea. Maybe one of us said it to the other and we just wrote it down. But we kept anchoring ourselves in that repetition of the line to remind ourselves that, this is not a book about arriving at a final destination, and that's why the last section is called Land Fallings, plural. There is no way off, but there are many ways to advance into possible futures.
Actually, it's not plural; it's just landfalling, dear.
Is it?
Yeah, don't worry. It's a gerund.
Damn it, Julian! Now we have to go back and rewrite the book.
No, Tom, no, it's fine.
We have to make it coincide with my memory.
Landfalling is a process. It's something you want to get done with. Yeah, I mean, it's a refrain because you have to. It's there's so much work that goes into remembering to forget things, so you have to counter them by remembering to remember.
That's a good way to put it.
Yeah, that's great. That, I think, really leads well into the next question, which is your second chapter, titled "No More Rainbows," reminds us that the conclusion of the flood story is much less of a conclusion than we often remember. You examine what the rainbow means, which is not at all clear in either the source text or the various cultural moments that you reflect on, as well as the questions raised by Noah's post-diluvian drunkenness and Ham's curse. What have been some of the interpretive cruxes in that part of the biblical story, the landfall, the disembarkation?
And I think this goes back to what we were talking about a little bit earlier in the purpose of the book. So, everyone knows the story of Noah and the ark from Genesis, except no one really knows it as it's in Genesis. And the assumption from all the mostly juvenile retellings of it is that it ends with the rainbow, right? That's the moment of celebration. That's the punctuation mark. It's kind of the rainbow as an arc that forms a dome over the new world and seals it in, except there's a point at which we call Genesis an anthology of beginnings and beginnings again. And it's a book of incompletions. It's a spur to more stories. And the rainbow is in no way an end point. It's pretty clear in Genesis that, for God, it's a reminder for him not to send any more floods. It's not really clear what that moment means, other than he's pleased with the sacrifice of Noah, who's left the ark and sacrificed some animals. But does it mean that God at that moment has realized that floods are useless, that people are always going to be as wicked as they were beforehand? What is this moment in the development of God's relationship with humans? And all kinds of different trajectories happen. Jewish tradition goes one way, Christian tradition goes another at that point. But our point is the story keeps unfolding long afterwards.
Right.
Noah
And
lives
it
a
doesn't
little.
go very well.
Yeah, I mean, maybe also one of the worst things that can happen is you outlive the heroic portion of your story. For Noah, he's gone on just a bit too long, and last seen in a really humiliating series of circumstances.
Yeah, one of the things that I learned from your book was the rabbinical interpretation that his drunkenness might have something to do with like the potency of soil after the flood. Is that right? Or perhaps there's some lesson here. He should have planted figs instead of wine grapes or something like that.
Well, and John noticed too that that is part of the rabbinic tradition of rebuking Noah for his mistakes. It's so whereas in Christian tradition, Noah prefigures Jesus and is perfect in his obedience to God and blameless all the way through. So you have to kind of conveniently forget that he got drunk and what was going on there. In rabbinic tradition, he's much more problematic. So he makes a series of mistakes and things start to spin out of control at that moment. And maybe it did have to do with planting grapes when he shouldn't have. Maybe it had to do with his ignorance of, what the soil was like. Or maybe even if you go back even earlier, it has to do with the fact that when God told him to build an ark, he built an ark. Whereas other figures from the same narrative, that is to say, Cain, Abraham, Moses, when God declares things to them, they feel free to argue with God about those things, and God listens. The God of Genesis likes to be argued with. Noah never argues with him. He simply builds the ark and consigns the rest of the world to perish. Only his family are the ones who are saved. So there's a tradition in Midrash where Noah is very much taken to task for his failures.
And something else you discussed in that chapter is the 20th, 21st century political debates about the significance of the rainbow. I think it's like a right-wing meme, right? Take back the rainbow or something like that.
It was the Ark experience in Kentucky. Julian, talk about that.
Well, that was the image that greeted us at the end of a visit to Ark Encounter in Kentucky. I mean, I'm not sure I really want to dwell vastly on that in the sense that it's one iteration of the rainbow. It's an attempt to reclaim it, right, from its iconic significance as a sort of badge of inclusivity, and turn it into something else that is apparently prior. It's a very it was a very challenging, unpleasant experience. I'm not sure that. John, I think the way it's one moment in that chapter. It's not a vast. It's not something that we treat at vast length, although we have written about it outside the book in much, much greater detail, where we actually sort of do a sort of write up of what it was like to visit Ark Encounter.
John, I was going to say, John, I think what you get at is the rainbow is an ambiguous symbol. So it can be a promise, inclusivity, futurity. It can be trippy, groovy. It can be the rainbow of pride. It can be the rainbow of, valuing identities that sometimes get devalued. There's something that's really beautiful about a rainbow. However, it's also a weapon made of weather.
Right.
It
Thank
is
you.
literally a rain bow. It is a long bow in the sky. It's God's armament. And yet God doesn't put it in the sky to point it toward Earth. He points it towards himself to remember never again when it comes to sending floods. So we linger over the complexity rather than like to see it reduced to any kind of facile political message.
Right, and it's that ambivalence, right? The correlation of it as a promise and a marker of futurity, with also being a weapon, or a weapon in suspension, a bow that has been placed in the sky, but which could come back as a weather weapon that drives the chapter. That core ambivalence. We like rainbows. I mean, who doesn't like a rainbow? Right. I mean, we're tuned again to the way in which the rainbow sort of tends to default to a certain set of affects and feelings, that when you actually sort of expose yourself to the full range of ways it gets deployed, it becomes a much more uncomfortable, unruly sort of little icon.
Yeah. And John, we could even put this more strongly, right? Among the things we like about rainbows is when they signify gay, lesbian, bi, trans, questioning inclusivity, right? We want every identity possibly included in any refuge that's going to be fashioned. And it alarms us when somebody redeploys the rainbow in order to slam a door on it.
Right. And I think for me, the tension in that chapter is also the way that and I think this is actually quite important, that when you say that there is just something for, I love seeing a rainbow. It makes me happy. I go, oh, look, a rainbow. And the way in which that sort of quasi-automatic response gets synced up knowingly and unknowingly to fund particular versions of the world is something that I think is at issue in that chapter. It's a programming of responses, or
Yeah, how have modern novelists like Jeanette Winterson contributed to how we think about these endings? And endings in scare quotes.
Yeah. Boating for Beginners, which is just a wonderfully naughty title for a novel. I love that. I don't think of it as just Jeanette Winterson. I mean, Jeffrey, we should do collaborative overlap here, as it were, instead of mutual interruption. Because I don't think for us of that novel is really that separate from a whole slew of texts that are actually sort of written in the 1980s. The Not Wanted on the Voyage, and Julian Barnes's more than 10 and a half chapters, and even the sort of Jeanette Winterson's sort of earlier novel, The Oranges Are Not the Only Fruit. It seemed like at that moment there was an interest in sort of opening the Genesis story and exposing it to what a series of novelists could see as the narrative potential of sort of what's there and not there in the story. So that so there's in a kind of an explicitly archival cast to their approach to the story.
And Winterson, I think, is especially important to us because it was her playfulness that called to us. So there are plenty of Ark stories in which the Ark becomes like this fascistic, horrible, horrible space. Winterson just doesn't have time for that. She really is just trying to multiply possibilities, open up the world, tell counter narratives, put as many stowaways as possible on the Ark, tell as many other and differing stories, and just keep things in motion. So, we have this key scene from Oranges Are Not the Only Fruit, where it's a Brillo pad that's a chimpanzee on the Ark. It's a collage Ark where all the animals are made of different kinds of materials. But it becomes for the narrator or the protagonist an arc of play in which iteration and possibility go hand in hand. And that's what opened us up to thinking that a lot of people know their arcs through toys, and there's something that is joyful about toys and repetition and possibility opening up. So we liked how Winterson takes that and turns it into a narrative piece.
Right. And in that novel, the play is also part of a refuge. It's a sort of zone of play, but it's also a zone of refuge with a friend, essentially, an older woman, Elsie, who's and then in Boating for Beginners, the novel is it's almost impossible to describe in its wonderful absurdity. I think everyone should just go and read it now. It's hard to find, I think.
Is that the novel you would recommend someone start with if they were putting
for beginners? I mean, it's a it's kind of like time travel to
It's a
an era in feminism where so many challenges to patriarchy seem new and joyful. And I think now, it feels a little bit dated, but it's kind of got the seeds of all kinds of possibilities that were to follow from it.
it's beguiling as a novel in its in the amount of fun that is being taken in its writing. And
Yes.
I think stylistically, you had a question about advice to potential dissertators. I mean, if I could write like Jeanette Winterson, I'd be very happy.
Hmm.
In academic there's a certain joy that's being taken in inhabiting a story, trying to be faithful to a version of a story that you have in your head that you're trying to explore, while also troping it as you're doing it. And the notion that you're going to turn Noah into someone who was running a cruising business on the Euphrates river has just a certain amount of sort of mundane charm about it that it's hard to resist. The idea that you would just, without explanation, have a little orange devil running around who's never fully explained in the story, that in fact one of the protagonists, because there are several, smuggles an elephant named Trebor onto the Ark, about whom we find out nothing. There's a certain level of willingness to expose your novel to narrative threads that don't get resolved, that I think is just sort of deeply fun. It's a terribly short novel too.
It is, but Julian, I think what you're really emphasizing too is that we learned a lot from the text that we read about how to be properly respectful to the possibilities that they have, and then try to enact that in our scholarship. And I'd say another fundamentally influential text that we grappled with early on was Natalie Diaz's poem, It Was the Animals, which is about an ark gone wrong, and the ark is a fractured frame, and how much it means to break it, to break that frame in order to imagine possibilities beyond the enclosure of the ark. So we call the book Noah's Archive. It's an archive of possibilities, and I think one of the things that we tried to do is not interpret other people's texts, but to open up the possibilities that they enable, and to try to think with them and think alongside them.
You mentioned toys, and I think I had this the Playmobil arc that you discuss in the chapter.
Oh, right.
I had that, or I remember the commercials on TV or something. I definitely had some nostalgia there. Can you talk to us about children's toys and how toy manufacturers have appropriated the arc story?
Did you have the electric motor for it?
I don't think it had. Did it have a motor? I don't think so.
You can give it, which is just a wonderful idea.
It's an optional battery operated motor that you can attach to it.
Okay, I'm gonna be on eBay later, indulging in nostalgia.
It's for all ages, so
Yeah, absolutely.
This was the moment in the book when we also brought with us our children. So we talked about the toys, but as mediated for me through my daughter, for Julian through his son, because we felt like their experience of toys had opened up some possibilities of how to deal with pieces of the world, narratives of the world, which is to say, children seldom respect the stories that they're supposed to be enacting with their toys, and will bring them into all kinds of new directions. So if my daughter is putting her Barbie dolls on the ark and turning it into her own little version of a feminist utopia, that's great. That's kind of like one of the trajectories of the story. If children are indifferent to what they're supposed to learn from these stories, well, then what might we say about people in earlier times and the ways in which they used the story of Noah's Ark as something not to reverence, but to play with, to generate possibilities in the world with?
And I think we don't we don't spend a lot of time on this in the book, but I mean, one of the things I received from sort of toy history is the way in which the Noah's Ark story was part of the earliest sort of production of toys that certainly in a kind of from about the 18th century on, and I, at least in my sort of as I've sort of visited various museums and things, have been constantly sort of surprised and sometimes moved. I remember being at the Imperial War Museum and looking at a Noah's Ark constructed during the First World War out of sort of spent munitions by an English prisoner. In other words, this is sort of default kind of sort of way in which it's part of toy history as a story. I mean, my fantasy is because it's the ideal sort of from a parental perspective toy. The children, the act of beginning play is unloading it and putting it back together, and you get to put it all back together and take it with you when you're done, so that landfall and so embarkation and landfall are actually kind of provide a kind of narrative structure for a play event. I think it's interesting. You said we sort of absolutely, we were sort of both, I think, retrospectively allowed ourselves a walk down one of memory's lanes in terms of reimagining childhood for our children, but also re-experiencing toys a second time as part of what parenting actually is.
And how parenting always goes wrong. So as Julian said, ultimately, right, you want your child to clean up and put all the animals back in the ark. How often does that happen? Actually, not that often. Right. And it turns into something completely different, which is great and creative.
Yeah, I love that emphasis on irreverent play. Which is so generative.
Play is productive, not just as repetition. Not that there's anything that's just repetition. But
It also amazed us that when we looked on the Amazon page for the Playmobil Ark, also purchased with the Ark is very often a Playmobil manger set, and that makes a lot of sense. It's kind of the Christian story from Ark to manger. Sure, why not? But also purchased with it was a safari set, including one with dinosaurs in it. And it's just like, all right, it's about the mixing of worlds. It's about what you actually love, cherish, and want to preserve. It opens up much wider stories.
The third chapter surveys in part artistic representations of the flood, from Gustave Doré to the 6th century Vienna Genesis. This is the first time I had seen that latter illustration, and it's really fascinating. What are your favorite of the visual representations you discuss in the book?
It's really hard. It's like choosing your favorite child.
I know. And then, of course, you sort of all the ones that didn't go in that you wish could have gone in. And
I have a favorite of the moment, Julian, but it's not. I don't know that it's my favorite.
What's your image du jour?
So I often talk about a William de Brill's one as that got me thinking, only because I'd seen it in Baltimore and I just could not get it out of my mind. But the one I've been thinking about a lot recently is the Nathan Altman one. So Altman was a Jewish artist, refugee from Germany, created his amazing print at a time when all German Jews had lost their citizenship.
And Jeffrey, this is audio only, so should we describe it briefly?
So if you get the book, you'll see it too. You're right. It is a beautiful picture of a dog baying up to the rain, and the rain is coming down like slashes. The dog is on an island. At first, it seems like it's an island with a couple of pine trees and the dog is by itself. But on closer examination, you see that the pine tree is actually a bunch of ravens holding onto a stick with one raven circling. It has no space. The dog looks up to the sky and is wailing miserably. And in the background, you can see the ark sailing away. So the dog has been left to the outside of the ark. It's got nothing left. And the ark, the refuge, sails away. And for Altman to have created this image at a time when his very identity as Jew made him outcast, liable to be left behind, a body that can be taken to a work camp. This is a powerful moment that, especially with the recent burgeoning rise in anti-Semitism, has just been a thing that's been on my mind. So I think about that picture a lot, actually. Julian, how about you? What's your favorite of the moment?
Oh, I'm terrible at favorites of the moment. I mean, the Altman image is arresting, and I mean, for me, I think the thing that it part of the signature of that image is the way in which the rain. There's almost a sort of synesthesia about the way the rain is drawn as slashing lines, so that it's almost as though the rain actually provides the audio for the image. Mm-hmm. That it's a scream. The lament of the dog, is this sort of abandoned companion animal, who wasn't companionable enough to make it aboard. Is rendered sort of viscerally in the actual medium. I mean, so that is, that's absolutely it. No, I mean, I think I'm worried for listeners, right? If they, to have people describe images to them that they can't see. I think to make good, I mean, the William de Brail's image, which is at the Walters Art Museum in Baltimore. I mean, I'll just sort of describe that very, very briefly. There is no arc. It's what you see is gold and green, and the green is the water, the waves underneath the arc of a flooded world. And as you look more closely at the green, you start to see figures of people, figures of birds, figures of livestock, all in discrete layers. And the closer you look, they all seem to be sleeping or suspended. And it presents a sort of the on the one hand, the sense of loss, but you're very uncertain about what you ought to be feeling as you look at that image, because it is a figure of suspension. It's almost like they could come back alive. But in the moment they're not, and there is no arc. So where are you supposed to be in terms of where you're located? And you're just looking at this. It's a very powerful image.
And that question of location is one that really fascinates us with images. So John, you brought up the Vienna Genesis. One of the reasons that one really stuck in our mind is the Vienna Genesis illustrates a pyramid-shaped arc as it sails away, leaving people clinging to rocks. This is the very first illustrated Bible that we possess. But number one, right? The first one to survive. The fact that the artist chose to stand with the drowned depicts something that is not in Genesis. There's no such moment there. Really spoke to us as being an important anchoring moment. And indeed, throughout history, that is a common vantage point, not to imagine yourself on the ark in that space of safety, but to imagine what it's like to have been left behind by that ark. It's too late. It's already gone. You've got moments left. And here's what the artist depicts standing with the drowned.
Thank you for taking time to describe those images. I know some of the listeners are commuting while listening to these podcasts. So good. Please wait to Google image, search for these images until you've arrived at your destination and disembarked yourself. I learned from your book that the inside of the ark has been metaphorized as a way of thinking about ordering knowledge, understanding memory and history, hierarchizing, and taxonomizing. Can you talk to us a little bit about how the organization of the ark has been thought, reimagined, described?
So Genesis gives very little information about what the inside of the ark is like. It seems to be maybe that it's 3 levels and we have a number of cubits, but we don't really have much more beyond that. And honestly, even the 3 levels, what does that mean? Can there be a bilge at the bottom? Is it 3 levels plus other possibilities? So you don't get much when it comes to imagining what the interior is like, and you don't get much when it comes to imagining what life is like. I think one of the pivotal moments for both of us was There's a moment in Midrash where after the ark has already docked and life is going on, when one of the sons of Noah, I think Japheth, is asked, well, what was life like on the ark way back when, now that humans have resettled? And he says, well, it was terrible. As soon as we were done feeding all the animals during the day, the nocturnal animals woke up. It was nothing but chores and cleaning. And in fact, life on that ark was horrible. I'm glad to be out of it. It's not a thing that you ever imagine, especially because there's so many visualizations of tranquility, suspension, happiness, peace on the ark. So just figuring out how an arc works, I think, is such an invitation to the imagination, but you've got to make a choice. Is it going to be a utopia or a dystopia? And throughout history, people have gone each way. There are as many different ways of conceptualizing the inside of the arc as there are permutations of the human imagination.
Absolutely. That sense that here you have, because an arc is essentially drawing a boundary and saying, here's an inside, everything in here survives, everything outside dies. Okay, 3 lines, maybe a window and a door that's closed from the outside. And make it. And that act of trying to then actually imagine that inside space is a moment of, one of the things I found when I was listening to Jeffrey, and I was thinking, yeah, absolutely. One of the strangest things is that sort of contemporary stand-up comedians who do bits on the arc end up sounding a lot like 17th century, 16th century theologians who are trying to do a bit on the arc. In other words, there's a kind of wonderful sort of discursive leveling in terms of what it means to become a reader, imaginer, reenactor of that story that I find just sort of deeply compelling. And what's compelling to me about it is the way in which the most profound questions arise out of this sort of the difficulty posed by trying to imagine this insight. Like, how would it work? How literal are my instructions? How figurative or metaphorical are my instructions? Which bits of this story shall I allegorize? Which shall I not allegorize? And it's all of those sets of challenges which leads readers and reenactors to have to actually wrestle with what it means to try and make a world and the consequences of what you're unmaking by making that world. We could get into, but the list of possible interiors is almost endless.
It's infinite. It's absolutely infinite. So much depends on how much cheating you allow yourself. Will you say that everyone is in a kind of suspended animation where bodily needs go away? Or will you imagine what it's like to need a sufficient amount of food to feed all those animals and humans? And also, what do you do with all the manure? Where is that going if the ark is self-enclosed? What kind of feeding system? Like, the minute you start to open it up, it becomes too big of a world to almost imagine in its details. And even the most specific imaginings cheat at several places, and it can be as simple as saying, well, there was one type of bear that was put on there. It's the prototype of all bears, grizzlies, polars, you name it, but only one type. And you can keep taking that back so that you reduce your number of animals to a manageable amount.
So what happens then is, in the course of actually designing it and imagining it, you make a series of decisions without being fully aware that you're, say, taking on board a theory of evolution, or how species works, or where race comes from, or what a family is, what a family needs. All of these get produced or become, your sets of assumptions become visible by the way in which this sort of vacant sort of space gets filled in. There's a wonderful art historian, Hubert Damisch, who actually ventured that the Genesis narrative was really one of the first texts of risk management, which exposed people to the kinds of sort of having to think about space and process, and building and construction in those ways. That was an invitation to doing that.
I think
you were good enough to share your questions ahead of time with us, and we know what we're moving toward, but it is a discussion about how the arc starts to sail into narratives of the enslavement of people stolen from Africa and brought to the Americas. This kind of arc thinking that we've been describing has a horrendous historical effect of enabling people to think through what are the minimal conditions of survival on a boat for long durations. And that occurs by thinking through how each animal needs a certain amount of biomass in order to have its minimal conditions of survivability. And it's the easiest thing in the world once you've calculated what it takes to keep an animal alive for a certain amount of time to reduce human beings to animals, think about them in terms of minimal survivability, and start to ship them on slave ships and really realize the blueprint for Noah's Ark in a horrendous way that still haunts us, honestly.
I think that leads us into the 1787 diagram of the ship Brooks, which was created in part to advance abolitionist causes in the 18th century, or circulated in abolitionist publications. Can you talk to us a little bit about how this diagram fits within the tradition of arc thinking?
I mean, I think I'd want to acknowledge Larry Shannon's work in The Accommodated Animal, right, as a point of arrival in early modern studies, and the coda to that book, which explicitly sort of draws a connection between John Wilkins' the image of the box-like ark with the animals sort of inside, from John Wilkins' essay Towards a Real Character and a Philosophical Language, which from 1668. And there's a striking sort of formal similarity, not that I'd want to sort of necessarily, there's no direct connection necessarily between those two images, that's quite striking in terms of the way space is being conceived. So in terms of a sort of, that's something that resonated for us and was something, I mean, we're not the first people to point out the visual similarities between that. But the Brooks image is striking because it circulated so widely and in so many different forms that it became, and it was also, it looks like a plan, but it is a memorial reconstruction. If my memory serves, the captain who was invited on board the ship had to sort of bring out the dimension that it had to be reconstructed by someone who wasn't actually aboard the ship. This is what I remember from my footnotes.
And that's right. And the amazing thing is that the picture doesn't even show the sheer number of people that were on the ship. It's just the maximum number of people that could be illustrated as part of that diagram.
Right. So that it's a complicated image that isn't quite. That sort of takes on a life of its own, in terms of it being also, I think, one of the first uses of an image in that very particular kind of way, as a badge of a movement.
And from that movement, it sails into all kinds of possibilities. The image itself was used to raise awareness about the inhumanity of the slave trade. One of our chapters explores the trail that the arc kind of sails through much literature that had to do in the wake of the Civil War, and how, especially for Black authors in the United States, it became an ambivalent symbol, sometimes redemption, sometimes horror, but the arc becomes laden with possibilities. There are many.
Right. Yeah. Well, it's also I think the way in which the arc is indexed both to Genesis but also Exodus, and so to two very different narrative trajectories, right? And the way in which it takes on a kind of counter arc status, in some representations, so that it's I'm thinking of Sun Ra and the orchestra, sort of specifically in a kind of cultural counter arc, or a soul boat in Henry Dumas' Ark of Bones story. But yeah, I mean, the Ark has a kind of core constitutive, very important kind of role in African American literature, art, and culture, and I think one of the things that we felt was that was just a profoundly important part of the and also speaking back, I think, to some of the programming, the allegorical programming of the Ark in the 16th, 17th century. So that was really the most exciting place where something was really happening as far as we were concerned, in terms of the sort of trying to open the possibilities of what the Ark narrative might generate. And I'm just going to turn into a list of names which you can encounter in the chapter if you want. From Hortense Spillers to Jennifer Morgan, Christina Sharp, Fred Moten, and co. I mean, I think if we had a role, it was putting them all together in one chapter.
Right. And one of those stories that we love and linger with too is Zora Neale Hurston's Our Eyes Were Watching God. We love that story for many reasons. It's just brilliant, but it imagines a post-flood, it imagines a flooded world and tries to remember people that history worked really hard to forget. It reconfigures terms of refuge to make them more local and locates what would be an ark in any other story to places like porches, homes that you inhabit for a while, lives created from contingency, happenstance, but also an assertion of agency and happiness with the main character. And there's a relentlessness to her that I think really makes that story work well as a counter narrative to an art story.
But yeah, and it's also the sort of the way in which something profoundly productive comes out of something so horrid.
It's great.
Stowaways figure heavily in the book. You conceptualize metaphor as a kind of stowaway. Methuselah, woodworms, all stowaways. You argue that listening to stowaways can help decenter the human, and it can remind us of the boundedness and limitations of human-centered narratives. Why might thinking of metaphors as a kind of stowaway allow us to see the Ark story differently?
And one thing that comes to mind from that is that, in fact, the Ark story is a metaphor that is stowed away in our own imagination and keeps unfolding certain kinds of thinking for us without us being the ones who launch that thinking. That is, Ark thinking can inhabit your cognitive frame and make you expect certain outcomes, expect certain plots to unfold that aren't necessarily the ones you would choose if you had some distance from the metaphor that's generating the stories that you're in. We love the idea of stowaways on the Ark. It's the refusal to say that the Ark is enough, and you're going to place aboard it all kinds of things that you would like to see saved, and also the kinds of things too that people will be surprised that wind up inside. Some of them will be plot devices, some will be actual human beings, like Shakespeare in his plays are frequent stowaways on Noah's Ark. Unicorns wind up there an inordinate number of times. All the things that you didn't want to leave behind so the world can begin again wind up being placed in that Ark to be rediscovered.
And metaphor is a process of, you take two things and you enter them into relation to one another, and usually there are unintended consequences as a result of that process. Sometimes they're good and productive, and sometimes they're like, oh no, oh gosh, no. Right, and so there's always it's also, I think, to a certain extent, you sort of the question emerged from a sense that stowaways enable us to kind of question sort of human primacy. But I think in part, it's also just the sort of relationship between a maker and the process of making. the fact that you may, set a process into motion, but what you end up making by its end will not be what you intended. There are going to be a series of unintended consequences, partly because it's about a sheaf of different agencies that work together. But this notion then that the arc can never be is always going to actually produce things, that stories might produce things that were never intended to go into them also. And that's also sort of partly what drives the chapter I think we pitch it as a pre-landfall intervention whereby everyone is safely escorted off the ark in ways that does not reduce who and what they may be. So that everyone's invited off in a way that, and you have to keep checking, because there's going to be more on the ark than was ever put on. You sort of mentioned woodworms. The one that I think the one that we love to a certain extent is the ark that becomes sentient.
So one of the things that we recently came to realize too is that the arc, and this is in the novel Aurora, which is written by a thing called Ship. Ship is the sentient arc. Any intergenerational spaceship is an arc, and Ship launches the story of its own becoming into the novel. And it is a kind of AI that's self-narrating and also loves its cargo. And there's something that's so beautiful about this particular version of the arc. Let me put this another way. Many of the arcs that we encountered would be absolutely horrifying to be trapped inside. They're fascistic, they control your lives. There's a real terror that can be part of life on the ark. In Kim Stanley Robinson's Aurora, the ship comes to recognize that it has a responsibility to the people that dwell aboard it, and even comes to love them and sacrifices itself so that some of them can be saved. But it's also a story of a kind of artificial intelligence coming into a sentience that I think shows a version of arc thinking that's weirdly affirmative and utopian. And it's very sad when the ship dies at the end.
It is very sad, though I'm not sure, Jeffrey, that everyone on board the spaceship will shares our sense of attachment to Ship, because they're not privileged to be able to have Ship's growing self-narration as they're on board. It's also the beginning of Law, of the Ship also actually acting as a intervening legal authority over the passengers. So my guard is raising as we speak. Sorry.
No, it's a story of possibilities, but also limits. And Julian, the other thing that we know is that the ship can't see the animals aboard the ship, meaning that the ship cares deeply for the humans, but the animals are just food. There's no care for anything besides the human. There's no.
So it becomes what it becomes is a sort of something that, in terms of arc thinking, in terms of sort of what's really I think interesting, or what Jeffrey's sort of saying is that it's one of those occasions in which the structure of the arc that's being made actually sort of narratively, and this is what Kim Stanley Robinson does, starts to try and think itself. What are the duties of an arc? Does arc have duties? What's the status of a container? Am I just a container? What happens when you tell a container that it's got to build a story or tell the story? Is this a history? What do I leave in? How do I put out? All of these sort of fundamental questions get asked very explicitly. So it's a fascinating novel in those respects.
A fascinating novel about conservation, but also about the limits and possibilities of narrative. So narrative and conservation become the same thing there. Some really deep and probing questions about arc thinking that we love as part of this book. And I have to say, I also love that this book can do something like look all the way back to the Epic of Gilgamesh, one of our first recorded stories that we have, all the way forward into contemporary science fiction and climate fiction, and show that there is a line that connects all of these things to each other as shared products of the human imagination as we think about the limits of what should be saved, what refuge is, what we want to remember.
I've asked you to read a passage from the first chapter titled How to Think Like an Ark. And this is an excerpt from the final section of that chapter, which is subtitled Envoy.
Right. So it's the launching, as it were, of everything that follows. So in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth, but this act of origination did not start from nothing. The world was formless, clothed in darkness and full of water. The breath of God, or divine wind, Ruach Elohim, swept across the surface of the deep. After inaugurating night and day through the declaration of light, God parted these waters into an above and a below, a celestial vault full of rain and an ever restless sea. God ordered the cosmos into regions and time into days. Dry land was drawn from general flood. The firmament blazed. Earth and ocean were populated with all manner of creatures, including the first humans, lords of a walled garden. The world was full of life, and it was good. God rested. The deepest rest.
In the beginning of the beginning again, God opened the windows of the vault of heaven and unleashed the fountains of the deep, drowning the still young world. The creatures fashioned in God's own image had filled its lands with strife. All was in upheaval. Things had admittedly gone bad from the start. For their trespass, Adam and Eve were banished from Eden's enclosed perfection. Their descendants had built cities, engendered tumult, proliferated wrongdoing. The world was full of peril, and it was not good. As separated waters rushed into union, the force of flood obliterated the life that God had with such care fashioned, creatures that Adam had named and overseen. Yet, in an ark carefully constructed at God's command, obedient Noah preserved a representative selection of kin and beasts against the arrival of weather-borne catastrophe. After long months at sea, this meticulously curated archive came to rest atop a mountain. A new covenant was sealed with a rainbow, the promise of never again. Peace, doves, and olive branches, a second Genesis. The work of repopulating the devastated earth commenced. And yet, the descendants of Noah again spread wrongdoing across the emptied land. The sea rises.
I'd like to ask you about craft, how you go about putting together paragraphs like these. I should say, so Julian read the first paragraph, Jeffrey read the second paragraph, and then The Sea Rises is set aside as a single sentence paragraph. What stylistic choices jump out to you about these paragraphs?
I love the paragraph because I don't think we made any choices. We just wrote it. We wrote it together somehow, and I don't even know when. It's clear to me in reading it that we are riffing on Genesis. There's a point in the book we call all later arc stories Genesis fan fiction. I think this is kind of Genesis fan fiction in action, where we're taking some of the modes of phrase there. And, we've looked at Genesis in many languages and in many translations and just riffing on the possibilities within that variety of translations, but also trying to make it into something that's new. Julian, I don't want to speak for you, but I feel like I know your writing well enough and know what I love about your writing to say that we both really love words. We love thinking with words and seeing how they're expressed. And to me, there's something that's finely crafted about those sentences without them being overwrought. Because we didn't overthink this. It just came from an invitation when it became obvious to us that our book needed a clearer introduction that would set its terms better. This came out as a way of launching readers into what follows. Julian?
I think what Jeffrey is alluding to there is that we had a wonderful introduction, which was perfectly clear to him and I, that had the ungainly title, "What is called arc thinking?" without a question mark, which is actually, in full disclosure, a reference to Heidegger and his mode of thinking, in terms of posing a question in a very mechanical way to draw attention to the peculiarity of it. And what is called arc thinking? It's a horrible sentence that doesn't quite work because there's too many objects. And so we had an introduction that was really an attempt to articulate a method. It was big. It was really a placeholder for us in terms of everything that then happened in the book. And so the envoy or the envoy sort of emerges, I think, as a complete. I mean, at the end of a process. I mean, the writing here actually is probably from very near the beginning. So a lot of it of things we'd written, but it comes back in a completely different place, doing a very different job at the end here. So, in other words, we just wrote it is sort of true. It's like true of everything. But this chapter was probably the one that changed the most in the course of thinking about the book, and it lived with us for the longest. And the what really is happening here is a launch. I mean, a launch that's absolutely embedded in a sort of thinking. This is our reading essentially of the Genesis story right here, right? And the last paragraph, "the sea rises," is a completely ambiguously in its temporality, because you're in the Genesis story, but unfortunately you're also now. Very now, and so that launches or sort of provides a kind of vantage point onto the chapters that follow. But yeah, I mean, you sort of whenever you read, I think aloud a passage that you've worked on collaboratively with someone else, I think the thing that I always love is that you hear echoes of what you think is your voice, and then in the moment that you're hearing the echo of that, you're wondering if you're in fact hearing the echo of you remembering someone else's voice. And it's a wonderfully sort of strange experience.
It is, and it gets at how much fun it was to write this book together, and these just moments where things unfolded so beautifully. There's plenty of struggle in writing any book. And I think that first chapter, Julian just gave a great narration of that. That first chapter was a struggle, and we kept revising it. And, we're really grateful to our readers of that chapter. But the one thing that they always made clear is, all right, it does a lot of good work, but my God, it was so good to get beyond that chapter and into the actual book. And we recognize that if we were not more welcoming, we would not be launching the book sufficiently well. And so what we tried to do, especially in that envoy, was to give a kind of a gliding way into the ARC project itself, rather than to place impediments in front of any potential reader.
What I see in these paragraphs also is and I guess this is echoing Genesis, a very direct style, really strong subjects and verbs, rather short sentences, as a choice. Yeah, I mean, and I love the way you're rewriting this familiar story. Their descendants had built cities, engendered tumult. A great way to put it, engendered tumult, proliferated wrongdoing. This book was collaboratively written, and we've gestured towards some of that work in this conversation. How did you decide to write this together? And how was this project enriched by being a co-written project?
The last time I tried to narrate this, I emphasized too much that we were in a whiskey bar. So I'm going to be silent here and let Julian give the completely sober narration of how this started.
How did things start? Gosh, what a strange... It's a strange thing to remember. Well, I mean, usually they start out of the ruins of something else. So, to sort of give you a flavor of I think we wrote the book through using Google Docs. And the thing I love about collaborative writing with Google Docs is it's rather like you get to believe that there are elves and they do make shoes. There's in other words, I think a lot of the time with writing, for me, the difficulty is, you get stuck, or you get in a rut, or you go down a rabbit hole. And it's just lovely to go into a document and sort of see someone has sort of either cut something you've written, or run with it, or put something else different, or just put a little note in, "This goes here!" exclamation point, or something like that. And so if one of the, I think, perils of sort of solo academic work is a certain loneliness. I think there's also a kind, and this is sort of probably the whiskey bar, is the materialization of the companionship that I think comes with co-writing. It's a sort of intellectual and personal friendship that is where, and also a certain egging each other on too, I think.
We are really good at egging each other on. I think that's been one of the secrets to getting our stuff done. But we wrote synchronously and asynchronously, right? Yeah. So there were times when, because I'm in a different time zone, I'd come in and Julian had written something in the morning, or, I'd written something in the afternoon and Julian saw it in the morning. But then we traveled together, and sometimes we would sit at a coffee shop and simply write together at the same time into the document. So
and also something that I mean, everyone talks about writing, but also if you remember I think the last time we met before the pandemic hit, what we discovered, completely to our surprise, because we didn't think we were being productive enough, was the benefits of live rereading. I mean, because sometimes, I mean, I think this, and what I mean by that is that there's just a moment sometimes in the life of a project or something you're writing where you kind of have to sit down and kind of go, so what have I got? Where is this? A sort of stock taking moment. And it's really, it's easy to put off, and it's easy not to do, because you're scared to find out that you got less than you thought, or in fact, you now really understand what you were supposed to be doing, but you've got to do it. And there was something incredibly valuable about sitting down and just rereading together what we had done, and being able to actually then have that kind of in-person conversation about, well, what do you think we've got? Where, and for us, what luckily emerged was a kind of surprised sense of we had rather a lot more than we thought we had.
And Julian, I really want to emphasize too that it's the together that mattered here. So, you can read your own book out loud, and I think that's a useful exercise. I do it even for solo writing, etc. But you can still either overestimate what you've done or underestimate it when you're doing it as a constant reality check with a collaborator. I think it's much harder to go wrong. The other thing that I will say too is that I don't know that this book would be in the world if I had not done it as a collaboration with Julian. I mean, during the time where we were working on this project, I took on a new job. I'm a university administrator at a really large state school, and my job is all consuming. And I think that if I were writing a project like this by myself, I would have put it on the shelf and say, you know what, that is either for never or that's for 10 years from now. Julian's my friend. I really enjoy his company, and I really enjoyed showing up for this project. So it meant that this project was a haven and a refuge for me to be able to carve out some other part of my life where I could continue to do it. And that was especially true during the pandemic. But writing with someone is just so very different from the solitude of writing a project by yourself. And I think Julian and I are very lucky in that we're good friends. We really trust each other. There's no...
We're very fortunate in Minnesota, in University of Minnesota Press, and Doug Amato.
Did everything. Yep, absolutely. To write for a good press where we'd both worked, and to have that confidence that it would be accepted for what it was. That's pretty powerful.
Yeah, and we should shout out to the University of Minnesota Press. The book is amazingly well put together. The cover is Awesome.
We love the cover.
Yeah.
Yes.
In terms of collaboration, I suppose communication is really important as well. In terms of, maybe one author isn't going to be able to work on something until the end of the semester or something like that. Do you have advice for people that might consider collaborating? Strategies you found useful in working together?
I think I think one thing I would say, I think we both collaborated with quite a few people in various ways, in terms of writing and editing. And I think part of it would be to realize that every relationship is going to be different, and that what worked with one person might not work with another. And you really, really have to work through resistances early on. I think if you remember, Jeffrey, the very first time we went somewhere to Frostburg, and the first live writing we did together, we had to have a series of conversations about pronoun use, right? Because I think I was resisting using we initially, and I had to get comfortable. I mean, the wonderful thing I always joke is sort of like, the great thing about collaborative writing is that when you use we, it's actually a valid reference as opposed to a catachresis. Because there are two of you, so you actually are a unit. So it's a valid reference, which is very nice, rather than a kind of false inclusivity. But that has to get created. You have to feel comfortable, and sometimes you have to check back in. Are we actually comfortable being the subject of that sentence and what that sentence is doing? Because that sentence is also sort of the book as a whole. Jeffrey, what would you want to say?
I would want to say that it's the trust that really matters. So Julian and I do not ever work in a document with track changes. Each person has carte blanche to do what they want. And, there's a conversation sometimes about, here's what I did. What do you think about this? Most of the time it was, I love it. But sometimes it was, well, I loved what was there. And can we talk about this? I think without the trust, it's just not fun. I've collaborated enough where I've lost friendships over collaboration. Collaboration writing makes you vulnerable. And I think if both collaborators can recognize that vulnerability and be honest with each other and show up emotionally as well as intellectually, then it's hard for the collaboration to go wrong. That's also really important too, to be able to tell your collaborator when you can't show up for a while, or
Absolutely.
when they need to carry something for a while. And it all circles back.
That's great advice, I think. And just to backtrack with the we, you mean using we as two authors, multiple authors on a project?
Right. It's
we. They're kind of coercive. Of course you agree.
Well, no, I mean, it's not necessarily. I mean, I mean, I'm thinking about Stan. Yeah, there's a large conversation that you can track in about the sort of consequences of pronoun use in academic prose, and I think that's actually really. So I mean, part of it is the sort of the question, like you, right, can sometimes really default to a kind of false inclusivity because you're positing the other person as you're actually forcing them. And it's a very powerful technique, and we both use it to a certain extent. But we, right, is a certain various people, in terms of temperament, have and also in terms of standpoint theory, the kind of there's a kind of false inclusivity that we can generate. So there's something kind of wonderfully mundane about it actually being, no, it really is we.
It's just we. It's yeah, but also it's two people. But if you'd like to be a part of our we, welcome aboard. It gestures towards something bigger than just two, and we hope that we opened a door through which people feel very welcome to step and have this world for a while. And if they want to take the work and go somewhere else with it, that's awesome. That would be the greatest thing that you could do, is to find something here to run with.
I mean, this is great. I love talking about style and academic writing, and things like the discussion about we. As individual writers, what are your values as stylists? Do you have practices or habits that you found helpful?
Julian, I feel like you helped me to overcome my most self-destructive habits when it comes to writing, meaning that for me, writing is a little too of much of an ascetic practice of just like getting down to it and staying with the writing. And, even my last book that I wrote before this, solitary book, Stone and Ecology of the Inhuman, I overwrote that by 30,000 words because I'm so obsessive that I can do that. I severely injured my shoulder by being at my laptop too long and putting all my weight on it. Like there was too much solitariness that was in that. By writing with someone else and someone who has a joy in writing, it helped me to move beyond the obsessiveness that I think too often motivates some of the writing I do, and to open up the world a little bit.
I think overwriting is just a peril if you're on your own. It's what you do, I play lots of games as a writer, just in terms of sort of, I sort of feel like I'm happiest when I'm happiest when the chapter goes linear, in the meaning that you've got an introduction, you've launched it. So, for example, anyway, I was going to refer back. I realize I'm referring back to the passage that we didn't read. That we would have read, but never mind. You may have to re-edit this.
Narratives of inclusion and exclusion.
Yeah, right. No. I was the right. It was the Noah. In other words, when you've got your introduction out and you kind of know the texts that are coming next, but you don't really know what you're going to say about them. You just know that there's an order to what's happening next. That that this text is probably going to come first, and then so that's a joyous moment to me, because you're in that moment when the business of writing is showing up to work out. It's really about getting to reread while writing at that point. But I don't know. I always think it's a miracle every day I get up and write something. I'm sorry. I have very low expectations. I'm sort of I tell people to sort of sit at their desks and practice being at their desk. That's what I do. And eventually I'll get so bored playing solitaire or finding things not to do that I'll actually write something, and then I won't remember I've written it, and I'll be very pleased.
So much writing.
I wrote something. I wrote something today.
Yeah. And Julian, I don't know, do you write in a journal or keep a notebook or anything like that?
No, I'm too lazy for that.
See, because I'm too obsessive, I do jot things down in a notebook that I always carry with me. And I feel like if I can't put something into words, I can't understand it for myself. But that can be taken to an extreme sometimes. I remind myself that the life of the mind will kill you if you let it. I mean, there's a way in which it can just become too much.
I tell a lot. I don't keep a journal. What I do, and this is actually something that we did very early. It was like the first. Remember when we drew the book?
Yes.
Right. And the I'll keep. I find my problem with journals is that they're books, and I just never go back and reread what I've said. So it's like I can put stuff. I found stuff when I did try to do that years ago. It's like, that was a great idea. 20 years have passed and I've not revisited that page because it just never happens. So I do sort of keep things lying on my desk, and they might be there for like, a decade or something, staring me in the face. But we actually did draw the book as a kind of mutual parallel play note-making exercise.
And Julian, did we do that in a whiskey bar or not?
We did do it in a whiskey bar. So I don't think whiskey was being consumed. Not that I'm against whiskey, I just don't think we were having whiskey there. It's just
we were sitting in a whiskey bar drinking water, as I recall. Yes.
Yeah, that's right.
It was fun to even diagram the book. So diagramming the book was imagining a project that we might embark upon together. And a lot of the book we actually wrote is contained in that diagram, and a lot in that diagram had to be discarded because it was not the book that we wrote.
I do want to circle back to something you said, Jeffrey, that the life of the mind will kill you. Just as I
let it.
What's that? Sorry.
If you let it.
If you let it. I mean, that is something to keep in mind, for sure. Hopefully some listeners can adopt some of these strategies. for making an academic life livable, for sure.
Well, and the one other thing that I'll say too is that, Julian talked about having I don't have a journal where it's a Dear Diary. I always have a notebook that I can write things down. And I do that not so that I can go back and reread them. In fact, I seldom do that. I do it so I can get it out of my head. It's really important for me to be able to put those things somewhere else so that they don't have the grasp on my brain that they would otherwise have. And sometimes I do go back to them, or sometimes I'm drawing a picture or a diagram, or I'm using the act of writing in a book to liberate the kinds of thought that I can't do if I'm typing at a computer, which I find incredibly tedious. But writing on paper seems to open up my creativity in a way that a computer screen just doesn't.
And I think that's a great practice as well, drawing the book together, or trying to establish some kind of shared...
Well, we drew an arc.
Sorry?
We drew an arc.
We drew an arc with escape pods, as I recall, and bodies in the water, and mapped out all kinds of crazy possibilities for arcs.
Do you still have it?
In fact, we took a picture of it, and then we sent it to Doug Armato at University of Minnesota Press, and we're like, we're writing a book. Are you interested? It's really just that picture. And all hail Doug. He's like, it sounds intriguing.
This probably the notes are probably belong to that aspect of book writing where it's authors get overly fond of certain parts of their books, and the big disappointment is how disappointing they prove to others.
Well, there's that expression, kill your darlings, or whatever.
Oh, yes. It's a Samuel Johnson. I think it's more vicious than that.
Okay. Keeping all of that in mind, that's a legendary book proposal story. Emailing the picture.
Written on a bus ticket, yeah.
But John, it's also a story about how it's relationships that you form over time that can be sustaining, right? So for both Julian and I, there was obviously a time in our career where we didn't have an editor that was interested in the work.
Totally.
And, we're lucky enough that we both have writing records and have worked with the same person for a long time, where that has enabled us to do things that we wouldn't otherwise be able to do.
I mean, the piece of advice I got, having worried about audience hugely, was I'm not sure. I mean, when people give advice, it's always dangerous because you're not sure. Sometimes we interpret advice, which was never actually intended. I think is one of the things I've realized. That it was an idle comment that someone said to you, and you interpret it as life advice, and then vice versa, you miss it. In my case, I realized that I was getting lots of advice. I just didn't realize it was advice, and that was sometimes you need to just write and find out who wants to be in conversation with you, as opposed to being worried about joining a conversation, which is bad writing advice. Largely, I mean, most people would say that's the reverse of what you're supposed to do. You're supposed to find a conversation and find a way to enter it. And I think to a certain, I mean, when our collaboration really predates that, in the sense that we began collaborating because we both liked each other's writing, and it started out of a good 8-year period of simply having liked each other's writing and sharing the same spaces, and working out whether we liked each other as people or just liked each other's writing, right? It's a misrecognition sometimes. And then that turned into running a seminar together at the Shakespeare Association of America, and then co-editing a book of essays that tried to reimagine what a very inclusive, time-bound, occasion-specific group of essays would look like, that was very different from a kind of sort of edited book collection or something like that. And then that turned into us supporting each other through Stone, and then of Sheep, Oranges and Yeast, and realizing that we had this other project that we wanted to do together. So it's a very long, it evolved. It wasn't a, we're going to start co-writing. It was actually very late in, comparative, very recent development.
Mm-hmm. And it does tell a story that I think it's easy to lose track of now so many universities value productivity. Humanities productivity works differently. It takes a long time to do a project that really matters. Noah's Archive has, 8 years of work probably ultimately behind it. Anyway, a very long
2015,
build.
something like that. 2014.
Yeah. So, but I think it would not be the same project if we had rushed through it. It took the time that it needed, and there's no other way to describe it.
So now that Noah's Archive is out in the world, what are you turning your attention to? Is there a scholarly project that you're at work on, a course that you're developing, or maybe a hobby outside of academia that you want to dedicate more time to?
I'm going to track down my 2 children who just haven't seen me in 8 years, and I think they're living some. No, I'm trying to. I am not really dedicated to more scholarly projects at this point.
You're running a small country.
A lot of my energy is going into university administration. So I'm, John, I would say if there's a project that I'm putting time in right now, it is working with other people who care about the future and the vitality of the humanities in the United States at a time of great peril. So I've been trying to do that level of work rather than writing. Julian, how about you?
Well, you catch us at a fascinating moment in a collaborative relationship, because to a certain extent the book is done and has been done for a while. So our relationship is evolving as friendship, and also as a kind of open question as to whether we'll do something together again, which I hope we will. But what that will be, who knows?
Yeah, no. We don't know what it is, but I'm sure there is something. But the good thing about being friends, Julian, is that we don't have to know what that something is.
Absolutely,
right?
Yeah. And the other thing is, sometimes the bittersweet part of a collaboration is that you realize that it's over. And so ending this book was a lot of fun, but also a heartache in that sense, because it marked the end of writing together, of making something, and then you look at it and it's, oh gosh, it's a book. Gosh, it's so much less exciting than it was. And I'm in the early days of a very a project that I hope by the end will seem less strange than it is, about Shakespeare and political speech, and about strange, odd references to Shakespeare plays and political movements that look like they refer to performances, but actually are just part and parcel of an extended kind of ongoing political protest. So just as a quick example of that, there was a anti-nuclear protest camp in England in the 1980s, the Greenham Common Women's Peace Camp, which has a much deserved sort of sense of importance to it in terms of free speech and protest and the women's movement, and a potential performance of Macbeth that is associated with it. I say potential because I think there's almost no evidence that it actually ever came to be. But it is thematically almost, it is sort of strung through this. So this is a sort of I'm sort of rethinking who I am in terms of performance theory to a certain extent also, and sort of what it means to invoke a Shakespeare play and re-signify it as part of a political event. I won't say anything more because I don't really have anything to say. It's early days.
Congratulations on the publication of Noah's Archive. And we'll keep our eyes out for those future projects. Thank you so much for coming on the podcast, Jeffrey and Julian.
Thank you, John.
Thank you, Jeffrey.
Thank you, Julie.